Hey, Annabelle.
Hi, Nikki.
Oh, you haven't muted everybody for.
Can we mute ourselves?
They can unmute themselves. Oh,
You can mute us all, though. I think there's a way to do that.
yeah, you should probably do that.
Or we can just mute ourselves.
Or Fotini, you better ask that they do that.
I think it was muted. I just unmuted to say hi.
Yes, they're all muted when they enter.
Oh, but they can unmute? I thought, oh, I guess I've never done that before.
Well, they can, but we ask everyone not to do it.
Not to, yeah. Nice work, Aviva.
I'll mute. I'll remute.
Yeah, everyone's gonna have to mute.
We will just give 5 minutes so everyone can join and we can start.
You can see it keeps giving me a message. It says sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front, but you can see it.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I figured out how to get it. Oh, you know what? I just realized it's on auto.
So I think we're ready to start. Annabelle, do you need another minute? Or?
Just give me a minute because I'm just going to make sure. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Welcome to the first virtual BTOC event. My name is Fotini Pitoglu and I'm an executive member of BIT. Joining me today is Shona Seligman, also an executive member of BIT. BTOCs are a series of discussions of varying architects across the city. Presenters share their learned experience. We are honored to have Annabel Vaughan for this BTOC. Participants' microphones were muted upon entry. You're welcome to turn your webcams on. However, please note this webinar is being recorded. Feel free to turn them off if you feel uncomfortable. We do remind you to be mindful of your settings at all times. Participants will be able to ask questions during the second half of the meeting, which is the Q&A session. You will have the option to use the chat box to type your question or use the raise hand button, and one of the hosts will be able to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question. You can find the raise hand button by clicking on the icon labeled participants at the bottom center of your screen. At the bottom of the window on the right side of the screen, you will see the button labeled raise hand. The chat box can also be used for any immediate troubleshooting assistance and will be moderated by myself and Shona. Please note this webinar qualifies for one OAA conned hour. However, you must stay for its whole duration to receive the certificate. And now I would like to introduce Annabel Vaughan. Annabel Vaughan is a registered architect with the Ontario Association of Architects, a member of the RAIC, and a project manager of ERA Architects. She received her Master's of Architecture from the School of Architecture at the University of British Columbia, where her thesis examined the use of heritage buildings as mnemonic devices for the collective memory of cities and their public lives. She joined ERA Architects in 2015 after 2 decades in Vancouver, including 10 years at Birmingham and Hood, where she was involved in all aspects of design and construction, including the award-winning Mountain View Cemetery. Her professional work includes heritage conservation, small-scale landscape architecture insertions, civic and residential building design, urban design and research, performance art lectures, and curatorial projects. She writes, teaches, and participates regularly in discussions concerning the role that architecture and public art can play as agents of political change in the city. Annabel, we are excited to listen to your presentation. I will turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I guess, can everybody hear me and see the screen?
We can't see the screen. Unfortunately, we see it's black.
Pardon?
It's black again.
It's black again?
Yes.
Can you see it now?
We can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's the other thing is that doesn't work. There we go. Okay. So hi, thanks to everybody for dropping by. Thank you to BEAT for the invitation. This event, of course, was going to be fortified with wine and snacks and in a more intimate setting. But due to the weird times we find ourselves in, we're alone together and being mediated by the awkwardness of Zoom. So thank you for taking the time to join in. Hopefully you've all fortified yourselves, and I'm hopeful that our paths will cross in the real world in the months to come. Tonight, I'm going to take you through the arc of my 20+ years in architecture, which has been an interesting thing to do, called From Stairs to Scaffolding, which I think will become evident in a while. But I want to start by acknowledging that the land I have worked on culturally for the past 20 years is a land that was stolen from the original inhabitants and bears the heaviness of broken promises and failed treaties. I am indebted to the territory where I am currently living, Toronto, a settler colonial city situated upon the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, among others named, not named, recorded or unrecorded. I owe all that I have and all that I am to the land that I have grown up on. I am acutely aware that at this charged moment in time, my voice is one that really doesn't have much to add to the conversation. The conversations that are going on now, that I hope will radically change the way in which we phase into the new normal, are being stewarded by voices that have far too often been silenced and relegated to the margins and the streets. These are the voices that we need to follow. I'm actively stepping back and following the advice that I have seen on telephone poles. It's very slow to change. Just went to the end. Sorry. It's going backwards. Sorry, this always happens. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. Apologies. I'm actively stepping. Can you see it?
It's the black
It's
screen
right.
again.
Yeah.
Just don't enter the full screen mode if it's causing issues.
Is that okay?
We can see it.
Okay. All right. I'm actively stepping back and following the advice that I have seen on telephone poles around the city. Listen, learn, amplify, act. I am white. I'm a first-generation Canadian, the daughter of immigrants, white, English-speaking Australians. One side, a fifth-generation settler colonial manager of the penal colony from Ireland, and the other side deported for stealing horses from the British military, or rabbits, depending on who's telling the story. My parents came to Canada in the 50s, traveling freely as subjects of the British colonial system. They did not have their educations challenged or their professional status denied. They came with very little. We had no extended family in Canada, and my sense of humor was alien to schoolyard kids. The tales my mother told me as a child left me wide-eyed and full of wonder, like camping on the Murray River, where you would steal emu eggs from nests and cook them up sunny side up. The egg would be as big as your dinner plate. I grew up reading May Gibbs books with gumnut babies and Banksia men who would steal you from your bed at night, and trying to convince my friends that Marmite and then eventually Vegemite was really good. My parents thrived in their newfound home. I grew up in a politically engaged household that stopped expressways, shaped cities, and had incredible dinner conversations with all sorts of interesting people doing interesting things. I also grew up in a cash-strapped single-parent family and understand precarity and going without, but it never denied me access to the middle-class offerings of my downtown Toronto neighborhood. I started working when I was about 9 or 10. Alex Russell and I had a monopoly on all of the paper routes that had been handed down from neighbor to neighbor for a few generations. If my sister, my brother, or I wanted anything outside of subsistence, we had to figure it out, and we did. This was and is the white privilege I have grown up in. It has provided me with opportunity and connections that are undeniable and made my path through the profession less foreign and accessible than many. When I was asked to do this talk pre-COVID, I hesitated. What could I possibly offer the discourse? I am at best an ambivalent architect. I struggle to find a place in the profession that feels authentic and rewarding But it is the path that I have put myself on, and I have had to come to terms with all of the contradictions as it has made me face and reconcile what I love about small a architecture and the capital A profession, a profession that I find myself at odds with more often than not. I'm not interested in an old boys club with a language and culture that is elite, exclusionary, and perpetuates the failed capitalist state that is collapsing all around us and failing the marginalized, the vulnerable, those whose dreams get systematically held back, and those who vibrate to different rhythms than the dominant narrative. As women, our paths through the profession are often eclectic and challenged by the unpredictability of external responsibilities, i.e. life. Life often throws us from the path of what some might consider a normal trajectory through the logical steps up the ladder. The past 20 years of practice have been anything but straight for me. They've been challenging on a million fronts, rewarding beyond a doubt, and left me questioning what my role at this charged moment in time might be. What does it mean to take our largely white male profession and radically shift how we listen to the diverse voices coming up through the ranks? How can we amplify their experience and voices to blow open the conversation about the responsibility we have to the profession, to the public realm, and to the change that we are marching for in the streets? I've been thinking a lot about what change looks like and how to listen, learn, amplify, and act in solidarity. The pandemic has thickened time, collapsed space, and made me think about how much I love incidental touch, hugs, hands touching ever so briefly as things are passed between friends, casually bumping into someone as you awkwardly navigate the elevator door. The spatial, haptic, and oral landscapes have been radically altered. It's hard to imagine what the new normal is going to be. No more touch without risk and anxiety, no more derivés. Walking has become structured and labored by the measure of 2 meters, and the bird sounds drown out my thoughts some days. During the first Black Lives March in Toronto, the helicopters were so loud I went outside to see what was going on, convinced they were landing on my street. And then I realized that I had not heard them in the airspace for months and was shocked at how much noise we have been immune to. Architecture is a profession saturated with liminality, thresholds that are curated, perceived, defined, constructed, and bumped into me. For me, it is the subtleties and nuances of these borders that signify profound moments of beauty and anguish and moments of justice and injustice. The moments that resonate with me are the ones that create dissonance, the vacillation between the either or, the moment that hangs as you search your memory for what used to be in the whole of a demolition. The outline of a staircase traced across a recently exposed wall, a public art installation that inverts the reading of a space. Scarpa's door heights marked by bronze set into stone, the crisp edge between shadow and light, contours of a topographic shift. Sarah's blades of concrete that slice through soy fields in King City, the considered precision of a section line, the technicality of a dew point in a wall assembly, Charlotte Perriand's profile tracing the surface of an unattributed chaise lounge, bridges traversing ravines. 54%, 28%, 13%. The line between women in school, women in the profession, and women as principals. Curb edges that instinctively trigger the habit of looking left and right, property lines demarcating the private from the public, the 49th parallel, or the more policed Rio Grande, the hard gray built edge against unruly green scribble of the natural world, the foamy etch of the ocean as it climbs the beach, the shadow line of the perfect drip edge. I could go on. So I thought I would situate this talk in a few ideas and a few of the projects I've worked on over the course of the past 20 years. And I'm going to start with a quote from Lisa Robertson, who ran an amazing project in Vancouver called the Office for Soft Architecture. And she wrote about scaffolding. Planks for scaffolding should be carefully inspected and tested. Men might spring on the planks or tap them for sound. These tests are not likely to injure a good plank. Photographs of special scaffolds and other rigging do interest us. They are speculations of ghosts. In preparations for the photograph, the men should arrange themselves on the scaffold as in a frieze, standing with their various brimmed hats against the sky, or sitting, swinging their legs from a more supple plank, with the hacked forest behind them, or the bare place that will become the city. We find such an image quite attractive. Firstly, a scaffold lists in every way. Lists as in a record, a number, a law, a row or rows, to enter, to register, to enlist, a method, a border, a bordering strip, a salvage, a strip of cloth, a stripe of color, a ridge of furrow earth, to produce furrows or ridges, to list a narrow fillet, listless and listing, a stuttering, a conceptual limp. Scaffolding is an analogy. It explains what a wall is without being a wall. Perhaps it describes by desiring the wall, which is the normal method of description. So this is an image of the origins of ballistic theory. And it's from a book on artillery by Diego Afano in 1628. And I love it because for me, it symbolizes the arc of architecture. One of the things that I think about architecture, I started school in 1989, and it was the most engaged education I'd ever come across. After 24 years almost in school, I landed at Waterloo and was finally at a place where I felt like I could learn. And the thing that was so amazing is that no matter how the cannon shoots you out, you land somewhere. And this diagram to me is sort of the basis of what I wanted to talk about tonight. Life intervened in second year. I got pregnant and had to drop out of school, and I had this lovely kid who's now doing this. And of course, these are the things that women confront. So I dropped out of Waterloo and took 3 years off to spend with Kieran before he went into school. When he entered school, I was out west at this point, and I entered UBC. I petitioned the school to go part-time because I knew what full-time architecture school was going to be like, and I had a 3-year-old child. I also had a very sick mother, so I knew I could only go part-time. And it was I was the first person ever let into the UBC School of Architecture part-time, and on our first workshop, I was running late for the dinner. This is a theme that you'll see in my work and life, as all my colleagues know. I ended up sitting at the table with all of the professors who I'd never met before, and I overheard somebody say to the other teachers that someone had petitioned to go part-time because they had a kid, and rolled their eyes. It was interesting. It's followed me through school. My first midterm review with my studio prof, I was told that I would be a good architect if I could learn how to commit. And in the first 2 months of architecture school, my son got whooping cough and I had to drop out of school for 10 days. And then my mother had a very bad reaction to chemotherapy and almost died, and I had to go to Ontario. But I finished my term and I finished in the top 10 of the studio, but I still wasn't committed enough for them. It's an interesting, it's an interesting legacy to sort of carry through. I was also jokingly called a harpy by a male professor in a crit once. It was an affectionate and condescending way by one of my profs to remind me how outspoken I was. And it's a label that to this day sits at the back of my mind, making me hyper self-conscious of my voice. If you don't know what the harpies are, in Greek or Roman mythology, the harpies are the daughters of Thomas and Electra, Oceanad. They are divinities of devastation and divine vengeance, faster than the wind, invulnerable, cackling. They devour everything in their path, leaving only their excrement. A lot of these images I'm just going to throw up because they were things that were in my sights when I was being taught. And this is, of course, everyone knows this image, Charlotte Perriand and the chaise longue, that was attributed to Le Corbusier forever, but it's actually Pierre Jeanneret and Charlotte Perriand who designed it. But this is the photo that I actually like of Perriand. She was a radical feminist and very independent woman and a mountain climber who had no qualms about pulling off her shirt at the top of the mountain, my kind of woman. This is another image that we all get shown, you know, the skyline of New York, the Beaux-Arts ball in 1931. But of course, what they didn't show you, and you can find it, it's in Delirious New York by Rem Koolhaas, was that this was also on the stage. Miss Edna Cowan, the Basin Girl, who is the future of plumbing in high-rise buildings. It's hard to unpack that image as a young woman in a predominantly male architecture school. I tend to gravitate to things like this. This is, of course, the triadic ballet, the Tarish ballet, developed by Oscar Schlemmer, that was one of the studios at the Bauhaus and ran from 1921 to 1929. This seemed to me to be more about where I was looking for my inspiration. I've always believed that architecture is like jazz, and one of my dearest mentors, Bill Peckett, once told me that architecture is like being a jack of all trades and a master of none, that we have to know a little about a lot. And it's always something that sat with me, and I think it feeds the way in which I think about the world. I was also thinking about these types of things a lot. This is Rachel Whiteread's work. This is House, that she cast a row house that was being torn down in England. And this is something I thought a lot about during my thesis, when I took on ideas of collective memory and mnemonic devices as how we assemble collective memory. This is her Water Towers piece, which now sits on the MoMA in New York City. Marianne Ray's work was seminal when I went through school. She produced one of the pamphlet architectures, and it's one that I have thumbed through millions of times. And this drawing was one of the drawings that first made me realize that contemporary drawings could be as powerful as anything that you had seen previously. My father took me to an exhibit of Indigo Jones's drawings in New York City when I was a teenager, and I didn't really think about it until I got back to school, about how important drawing is. And I still love to hand draw, and I think it's a dying art. But I spent my thesis thinking about a concept that Bernard Bosanquet, a British philosopher, wrote about in his 3 lectures on aesthetics. And he talked about this concept of difficult beauty. And I'm sure all of you know David, but David's hand is grossly out of scale with the rest of the body. And if you were to proportion this, his hand is massive. And the thing that's interesting is that our brains make it complete. Our brains complete it to be the perfect beauty that we see it as. But if you were to, if David was alive, his hand would be hidden from view because of its grotesque nature. And I ended up doing my thesis on this building in Vancouver. It's the BC Electric Rail building, and it is a building that captivated me, and I'll talk more about it in a little bit. But it was this place that I sort of situated my work. And I realized, putting this lecture together, this theme of sort of picking apart a building and doing forensic architecture is something that really has driven my practice most of my 20 years. This is the Empire Field in Vancouver at Hastings Park. And this was the first project I ever worked on, this giant stair. And it was at Birmingham and Wood. I worked there. I had an incredible tenure there under the amazing mentorship of Sandra Moore, who was a phenomenal person to work with. I was lucky enough to work with a woman who was the head of a firm, and we had an incredible design dialogue the 10 years that I was there. The stairs, you came up to the stairs and turned around, and at the very end of that field, you can see the field house that we were also working on, and I was involved in that. But at the top of the stairs, we put up these gun slots and framed views. These ones go out to the mountains, and this one goes out to the mountains and one goes out to the field house. So the idea was that you would look through these and get these framed views. And of course, I riffed that from Piranesi's Aventine Hill, Rome, the keyhole at the Knights of Malta. When you peer through this keyhole in the Aventine Hill, you of course see St. Peter's Basilica in the distance. And so, you know, there are no new ideas. While I was at Birmingham and Wood, I did a bunch of other things. I've always sort of had my hands in a bunch of different places. I worked with a group called Space Agency. We ran an international competition and we built the winning entry and stuffed giant balloons into one of the laneways in Vancouver and held a party for 3 days to try and get people to walk through the alley. The alleys are quite contentious spaces in the city, and it was an incredible weekend of events that was incredibly inclusive and really dynamic. While I was there, I also had the incredible privilege to work on Mountain View Cemetery. The 3 buildings in black were the only buildable footprint in 100 acres in the middle of the city. And we created a complex of buildings to modernize a 1950s cemetery building that was at the end of its life and reinvigorate the cemetery. We had an incredible client. It was a remarkable job to work on. It was 7 years of my life that was really quite phenomenal. And the very first night, on opening night, this was the skinny footprint that we had. There's a series of administration buildings. There were graves in between, so we had to bridge this portion of the graveyard. And then this building was a new celebration room that became a non-denominational space for celebrations in the city. And there was none. This was the only public cemetery left in the city. And the neighborhood fought very hard to save it. And it was a really remarkable process. This is the celebration hall at night. And on the first day, we got occupancy at 1 p.m. And later that night at 10 o'clock, there was an after party held for an art gallery that I was on the board for that went until about 4 in the morning. And the first people in the cemetery were artists from all across the city. It was a phenomenal evening and people just couldn't figure out where they were, which was really a nice way to open the building. It's also being used for this incredible program called A Night for All Souls, which is before Halloween. It's a pagan tradition to honor your dead. And this incredible artist, Paula Jardine, has for the last, I guess, maybe almost 12 years, held a night where she invites different traditions in to do various honoring of their dead. The image on the left is Japanese prayer flags. And the image on the right is a burn barrel for burning money from the Chinese community. But there are all sorts of incredible things. The Southeast Asian community comes in and does these beautiful flower mandalas, and there are all sorts of different participatory things that you can do. It was voted the best new cultural facility in the city in 2009, and it was used during the Olympics as site for art and music, and it's really taken on a life of its own. And there are moments in it that just make me happy as an architect, hovering roof lines that sculpt snow perfectly. And of course, the scaffolding before it was even built was beautiful. I also taught up at UBC on and off for the better part of 12 years. And that's been an incredibly rewarding way to keep connected to the education. It's really education that keeps me invigorated in the profession. And I've had the pleasure of working with all sorts of people and had amazing students and students who I'm now colleagues with, which is a really interesting flip. And students who I come back to you and talk to you about the impact you had, which is a really remarkable thing to have the honor to be involved in. And so all of this is going on at the same time while I'm still at Birmingham and Wood, and we're also doing all sorts of things. We did a remarkable study in Chinatown, a planning report on housing typologies for the old buildings in Chinatown to try and help the 100-year-old family associations redevelop their sites without losing the character of the neighborhood. And just before I left, I was invited to co-curate a exhibit at the building that I did my thesis at. And that was a really fantastic sort of culmination of I guess, 13, 14 years of work. The building was remarkable. The train used to go across the city and drive right through the building. It was the hub of the amazing network of streetcars. Vancouver had the most streetcars in North America at one point before they paved them over in the 50s. And I worked with a bunch of contemporary artists and set up the building. It's a very interesting building. When I was doing my thesis on it, there are 3 grids in the downtown core in Vancouver, and the 3 structural grids of the building, which is situated right here, are actually inside the building. And so there's this beautiful trace of the building that's structurally represented in the building. So that was an interest. Everything about the way in which I think about buildings and cities kinds of folds into these multiple narratives that I find quite captivating and keeps me going. When I came to Toronto, I was at the helm of an organization called the Center for City Ecology that curated a conversation around architecture development and civic process. And we ran workshops and put on exhibitions and educated neighborhoods, specifically out in Scarborough at the East Scarborough storefront, and worked with some incredible people, and just sort of, it was a really interesting moment for me just to walk into a world where people really didn't understand the role that City Hall had in architecture. And one of the things that I always teach about is that architecture is a political act. To be an architect, you enter politics. And if you don't understand that, you're missing something. It's not just about the eye candy and the beautiful images. There is this whole other side. And so to be involved with this group of people and work with them over the better part of 18 months was remarkable. And some of the people there were just incredible. Paul and Carol Robillard were amazing. Paul took on SketchUp and learned SketchUp. This was before SketchUp was before the Google Map was 3D, and you could put SketchUp models into the model. And of course, all the downtown cores had been modeled, but suburbs weren't being modeled. So we got this group of people who'd never used SketchUp before, never drawn a building before, to draw their buildings and map them and put them into Google Street View. And it was this amazing exercise. Carol Robillard stood up at a council meeting and talked about accessibility because she gets around the neighborhood on scooter. She was shaking when she stood up and spoke, but afterwards she gave me the biggest hug and she said, I didn't realize the number on those development plaques was a number that I could call. And it was a really fantastic moment. The other one that was great was we had a workshop on businesses, and there was this young guy, Caviar Narogo, who was a young kid, recent immigrant from Afghanistan. And I thought, oh man, business, this one's going to be hard for him to get involved with. But the amazing thing is that somebody put down a map and started talking about the local businesses. And Caviar just started going, oh, this one's here, that one's closed, this one's the hair cutter, that one, oh, these guys, they sell the most amazingest samosas. And I'm like, what's the deal, Caviar? You're like a businessman. And he said, well, my mom won't let me play in the parks because they're too dangerous. So my brother and I ride around the parking lots. And so, of course, his incidental knowledge in the neighborhood was all about the businesses, which I thought was really beautiful. And then after leaving the CCE, I rattled around for a year and I was thinking about what to do. And I realized that to get context, I needed to join a firm. And so I had the incredible honor to join ERA Architects, where I've been ever since. And I've been doing some incredible work with them. And of course, the thing about ERA Architects, as people know in this city, is it's not just a firm about heritage. There's an incredible cultural legacy at the firm. And the brain trust at that firm is remarkable. And the archive of knowledge, the skill set that's there has been the most incredible lovely thing to have been able to tap into in the last 5 years since I've been working there. I'm working on a bunch of things, but this one, 2 Queen Street, is probably the one that I'm most passionate about these days. There's a whole other lecture about it, so I'm not going to go into it here, but suffice it to say that it's a remarkable story and it's one to follow. But I also worked on the Broadview Hotel. It was the first project that I was lucky to shadow Annie Pelche in our office. She was going on maternity leave, and I picked this up for her while she was out having her sweet boy. And it was a learning curve, and I couldn't have had a better mentor to work with. My crowning achievement was to make sure that they put slate on the turret roof. They were going back and forth and saying, oh, maybe we don't have the money for it. And I convinced them that it was the bow tie on the building and that they needed to do it. So that was a good one. That was a good win. This is a picture that I took from the CN Tower of the Westinghouse building at King and Blue Jay Way, the King Blue condo. It's 2 walls of the Westinghouse building that are standing up and have been restored. It's almost finished. But I loved this image from the CN Tower. I was taking a friend's kid up to show him Toronto, and I pointed it out to him, and he was pretty impressed that that's what, and that's before we were down. We went down 100 feet to get all the parking in underneath that building. It was, the general contractor didn't sleep until the first floor was poured. But these type of sort of forensic investigations are really something that I enjoy doing. And quite often people will come to me in the office and say, can you look at this building and figure it out? This is 100 Simcoe, which has a really interesting history. It started off as a tiny little Clark's publishing house. Then there was the Great Fire in, I'm gonna lose the date. The Great Fire happens, and in 1904, Rolfe Publishing House, which burned down and has all these contracts with the government, joins with Clark, and they propose an addition before the Clark's building is even built. And so we get the blue and green hybrid. And then it turns into Brown's Publishing House, and there are a few modifications that go on. And then in the 1980s, there's this peculiar decapitation that happens, and new brick stories are put on, and it's modified quite a bit. And that's basically the building that we were left with. And so deconstructing it and trying to figure it out was a really interesting piece of forensic architecture. And there is whimsy and heritage. This is a piece of interpretation on a building at 17 Dundonald. And we went back and forth around the interpretation, because in the end, this building was demolished. It was a 1960s modernist commercial travelers building, maybe 1956. At any rate, it was demolished, but it was reconstructed. And so when we went to put up the plaque, we were asked not to make reference to the building. So we cheekily put up the text that says reconstructed 9 feet north, and gave the latitude and longitude of the original corner of the building. And last year I worked on House Divided, co-edited with John Lawrence, Alex Bezikovic, and Cheryl Case. And that was a fascinating project. Housing has always been something I've been involved in. I was really interested in the Vienna model and did a whole series of sort of precedents from around the world. But the photo on the right, my right, I don't know if it's your right, the A.E. LePage bungalow built in one day, to me sort of sums up housing these days. We used to build a house a day. Now we sell condos in hours. But one of the most remarkable statistics that came out of the book came from a piece of research that John Van Nostrand had done. In 1945, between 40 to 60% of all households in Ontario cities had built their own home, and 80% of these homes included a boarder or a lodger. So just think about that. 60% of all housing up until 1945 was built by the owner. In 1950, of course, that changes, and we begin to build housing as a commodity. It's a really phenomenal shift in the way in which we position housing, and it's a lot about what I think about and write about when I'm thinking about housing. I also had the pleasure to go to London for the first time. Having a kid when you're young knocks out your traveling years. And I ended up in London, and I walked into the Turbine Hall, And there was an exhibit on Annie Albers, who led the weaving studio at the Bauhaus. And it was one of the most profound and beautiful exhibits that I've seen in years. And this is all the women in the Bauhaus who were relegated to the domestic arts. Annie Albers showed them. She basically blew open weaving in the most remarkable way and got picked up by Florence Knoll. And when they immigrated to the US, she and her husband, Joseph Albers, taught at the Black Mountain School of the Arts. It was a phenomenon. If you get a chance to see it, go and see it. And these past few days and months, 100 days, 4 months, who's counting? I've been thinking about a lot of things. I've been going back to W.E. Du Bois' data portraits, these beautiful graphics that were commissioned in the States. W.E.B. Du Bois was a Black statistician, and he produced the most incredible graphics about how the Negro population was doing post-slavery. And it's a phenomenal piece of work. I've been thinking a lot about Theaster Gates, Stony Island Bank in Chicago. And I've been listening to a lot of different things, and I stumbled across this. Mitch McEwen is somebody I've been following forever. She ran an incredible project as a student called Superfront out of Brooklyn, and did the most amazing insertions into public space, and then moved to LA and is now teaching it at, I'm gonna forget where she's teaching right now. I think she's at Princeton. And I think the last thought I'm gonna leave you with is this. This came across the wires a couple of weeks ago, but Kennedy Mitchum, a recent graduate of Duke University in Iowa, suggested, she wrote to Merriam-Webster and suggested that they change the definition of racism, and they agreed. And so the addition that she had put in was that racism is a doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism designed to execute its principles, a political or social system founded on racism. So it moves from a determinant of human traits and capabilities and flips it on its head to include systemic racism. And I think that as we move forward in this profession, that I think it's a really good definition to pick up on and think about again. And that's all I have. I really just wanted to sort of walk through a bunch of different things and put a bunch of different things out there. I have a very eclectic career, I think. I work primarily between a firm, either my own small firm or somebody's firm. I teach and I do curatorial projects. And those three things seem to fuel the brain that the architectural education I took over 10 years. I started in 1989, and I graduated in 1999. Took me 10 years to get through school with all the things that I was facing in life. And then I just recently took the, I guess I slaughtered the goat and I gave up my firstborn and I joined the OAA a couple of years ago. And it's been an interesting shift in my head to say Annabel Vaughan OAA and to firmly stand within the profession. And it's a profession that I think has a lot of movement and growth. And I'm looking forward to hearing questions or what you have to say.
Thank you, Annabelle. And thank you everyone for joining tonight's Beat Talk. My name is Shauna, as Fatimi mentioned, and I'm one of the executive members of Beat. So we have about 15 minutes left for a Q&A. If you missed the instructions at the beginning, you can virtually raise your hand. So there's a button at the bottom of the screen and we'll unmute you, so please stay muted. Otherwise, you can feel free to type a message in the message box and we will read the question out loud for you. So give a minute for So I'll start with a question that I have for you, Annabelle.
Okay.
So given that architecture has such a long life from concept to completion, you spoke a bit at the beginning of your presentation, about how the nature of public spaces is changing. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, how you think we as architects can begin to design for those public spaces in a world that's constantly changing its rules and regulations for public interaction, not only during this pandemic, but with no real way of knowing what the norm will be when this is over.
The thing about the public realm for me is that, the way in which capital is structured these days and the way in which cities build out, the public realm is shrinking. And we have this very odd relationship. We go into spaces that we think are public and are not public. And, you always come across students, you say, okay, go find a public space, and someone will inevitably come back with, the mall. It's like, the mall is not a public space. You can be kicked out of the mall, especially if you don't look like me. And so, this notion, and it slips even outside, there are lots of privately owned public spaces that are slippery. We don't know if we're allowed to be in them. And I always tell this anecdote because I think, the power of taking over the streets is remarkable, because the streets truly are the last public amenity because we pay for them with tax dollars. And so there's a huge sort of piece around that that's quite symbolic and really fascinating. But when Zuccotti Park was happening and Occupy Wall Street, the reason that they chose Zuccotti Park is because it was one of the first POPs that was ever negotiated by a city, and they allowed for 24/7 occupation of it. They didn't have the stipulation, you have to be out at 10 o'clock at night and back in at 7 in the morning. And the organizers knew this. And so that's why they ended up down there. Not because it was about Wall Street, but that wasn't the reason that park was chosen. And I think that that's a really, knowing these things and understanding, what your rights are in the public realm is super helpful. And as architects, I always teach about the fact that, we have a responsibility to the edge of our building. Our building doesn't stop there. It's the edge of the city. And if we just stop at the property line, we're doing a disservice to the profession and to the community. And so to really think about that transition between the public and the private and how it works. And I think that those spaces need to be more generous. Those spaces need to be more forgiving. Those spaces need to, stop putting in the measures that, shoo people away. And I think there's a huge opportunity there. And I think that, one of the things we really have to fight for is not giving up streets. So there's a movement for streets to get absorbed into developments. I can think of one really prominent one in Toronto right now. Mirvish Village, a block of Markham, has been absorbed into the development site. Vancouver Art Gallery is thinking of taking over a block of Cambie Street because the site doesn't have enough public realm. And that, I think, is a very slippery slope.
Annabel, I have a question. So you have lots of experience in design with the public and for the public. So I'm wondering if there are any lessons learned that can be incorporated in the design process at architecture offices so we can be more inclusive.
Well, the most important piece of that puzzle is that the public knows their neighborhood. And that if you go in being the expert, you're going to get shot down. And that you have to, you know, Kaivar knew where every business was. He knew what was running, what was closing down, when it was closing down, what it sold, when their sales were. That's invaluable knowledge. It would take me years to find that out. And so every voice that comes into that room has something to share with you. And sometimes they'll say something and they won't even think it matters, and you'll be like, wow, that's incredible. Somebody pointed out that in this one block that we worked on, that there were no benches, and yet most of the shopping was done by elderly women on foot. You know, so it's things like that. So I think, you know, the public, you know, I don't like to think of serving the public, but I do think that the public that is who we ultimately are responsible to. That is who we owe a great debt to. And so keeping that in the forefront.
We have a question from Williamson, and they've asked, did her work on the Missing Middle book affect your work in the office at all?
I think you should ask somebody at the office. I mean, you know, I was labeled a harpy for a reason. I'm not shy. And my voice is, I do talk. I do have opinions. And I think everybody in the office is pretty clear that I feel very strongly that the global market has failed housing, and that the repercussions of it are devastating. And that I think that, you know, we all work with clients who are involved in that, you know, the pork belly trade of condos in the sky. And it's part of, you know, what we have to reconcile. It's part of what I have to reconcile. There are days when I, you know, feel like the grim reaper of affordable space. And I really fight back on that. I do other work to counteract that. I work on, you know, boards of artists run studios and try and secure spaces and try to help develop banking products that don't turf out vulnerable people. You know, I support the work of Park in Parkdale. And I think, you know, I am guilty and I am guilt-ridden. And, you know, I don't know. So, you know, it definitely instigated a conversation, but there's lots of work at ERA going on, working on these very critical pieces. You know, the whole tower renewal piece that ERA does is all about securing and saving housing. So it's not so far outside of the wheelhouse, but I do have to reconcile and bite my tongue sometimes in meetings.
We have a question from Catalina. I'm just going to unmute.
Okay. Hi. Thank you, Annabel, for the lecture. It was super interesting. And I have a question about architecture being political. So how do you think we as architects or students, how can we break from the bureaucracy of the government in order to benefit the community? And how do you think the OAA can become a tool between the design, the community, and all these entities that make up architecture and the built environment?
Do you have a few years? You know, it's a struggle, right? Because, I mean, I was in one of the first cohorts where women were finally at 51% of our year, right? And everyone thought, oh, it's a turning point. And, you know, and now you look at the classes and the diversity that is in schools is amazing, but it's not reflected in our profession. And I've really been thinking about this a lot lately. And I think, you know, here I am, an old white woman in the profession. And I feel like my role at this point, I say that lovingly to myself. I think that it's incumbent on the people who have the power right now, who have doors that they can open, to make sure that they are pulling forward the diversity and the voices and the people who are going to change the conversation. So, and I think there are lots of firms that do that, who actively do that. But it actually means stepping back. It means not going to the panel. It means putting up the younger colleague who doesn't have the experience or the voice or the background, but letting them do the panel. It'll let, you know, like all of these things, like we actually have to begin to step back, open doors, create a bit of a vacuum and see what happens, and let go. And you know, I say this all the time. I was born in the last month of the baby boom. I was born the last day of November 1964, and I really don't identify with the baby boom because I grew up in Generation X. But I gotta tell you, the baby boomers really need to let go. It's okay. The kids are all right. They've got it. They're much more adept than we give them credit for. And we really need to step back and, you know, enjoy what we have done, but also allow something else to evolve and not be afraid that it's going to be, yeah, it's going to be different. It's going to be scary. It's not going to look like what you thought it was going to look like. It's going to look like what you want it to look like, Catalina. It's going to look like what Cheryl Case wants it to look like. It has to be radical. It has to change. If we don't let go, it never will, right? We're sitting on it. It's a real blind spot in the generation that I don't associate with, that I am a part of.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's hard. It's gonna be hard for us.
But I don't want it to be hard for you. I want it to be generous and amazing and remarkable. And that's what we actually can choose to do right now, right? It's going to be hard. There's going to be some really bruised egos.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
We only have a couple of minutes left. I don't know if anyone would like to ask a last question.
Oh, Bill Peckett has a question. Let Bill Peckett ask a question.
Hi, Annabel. I have two questions. My first question is, when are you coming back to Vancouver permanently? And then my next question is, could you reflect a little bit right now on the kind of rethinking of public space that's going on? Well, at least it is out west here in the light of the COVID epidemic. We're seeing all kinds of kind of recapturing of sidewalk space and even parking space that's adjacent to sidewalk space as a kind of a flex zone now for more street activity, just because people are requiring more space. I'm wondering if you think this is going to have a long-term effect, or do you think that this is just reactive and short-term?
You know, I think it's going to be a bit of both. But, you know, I lived in Vancouver when Gregor Robertson just put in bike lanes. He said, enough discussion. We've talked about this for 15 years. I'm just putting them in. And everybody cried. It's like, oh my God, everything's going to die. You know, like the world's going to stop. And of course, nothing stopped. You know, I was in Toronto when the safe injection site opened. Everybody said, oh, the world's going to go to hell in a handbag. And people stopped dying. Right? So there are these bold moments. And I was driving along Dundas. Dundas has had a full lane bicycle cordoned off, actual bollards, a full lane in Toronto. And I noticed the paint lines going in for the gap in Toronto on Bloor Street. And Bill, in Toronto, they do this really great thing. You're riding on a bike path and then it stops and picks up 10 blocks later. For those 10 blocks, you're on your own. And so it's counselor and it's NIMBYism and it's all sorts of stuff. But I think that the bike lane infrastructure that's going in, university has a full bike lane from Bloor Street right down to Richmond. It's amazing, right? So there's all this infrastructure going in. And I think the one interesting thing that's happened right now in this past 4 months, and the one thing that I think we all have to hold everybody accountable in all levels of government, nobody can ever say again, oh, that's going to take 10 years.
Right. Yeah.
Because we have pivoted so quickly.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And it's been remarkable pivoting. Like there have been some profound things that were done really quickly and that we should stop and go, wow, that was amazing. What else can we solve in 2 weeks? I have a list of things.
Right.
Right. So I think there's something in that. And I think that if nothing else, if that were the thing, if that was the thing that everybody held all these politicians accountable to going forward, that would be remarkable. Because really what it showed was that political will is the thing that we need, right? Political will is what it is.
It's everything. Yeah.
It's everything, right? So, you know, I'm hopeful that, you know, my street will stay closed off for the rest of my time in Toronto. Shortening, Bill, shortening. The mountains and the ocean call, as does my mountain goat.
I don't know. It sounds like Toronto might have a hard time letting go of you. You've done so much amazing work.
Wow, that's very sweet, Bill.
Thanks for a beautiful presentation.
Thanks.
Just to add to that, I'm wondering, based on today's political climate, what opportunities you see for change in architecture moving forward?
I mean, the weird thing about the pandemic is that, you know, as architects, we didn't really stop, right? A lot of us, I mean, I know that there are gradations of that, but a lot of us just sort of kept moving along. And then this last week, I've really felt the slow time of COVID slipping through my fingers. And I just, beginning of this, that the construction industry was going to, like, we were going to all come out of our houses and there were going to be 10 new towers down Yonge Street because they were like taking up lanes and just getting the concrete trucks in and pouring foundations. And it was just like, so I think that the changes are going to be, there's going to be a lot of interesting discourse around what some people did, like Mitch McEwen and the folks out of Princeton and MIT, pivoting really quickly to start producing PPE and the production side of things, the micro production of stuff that happened, and that modularity that, you know, we never seem to be able to crack in architecture. It's never, you know, it's always like, oh yeah, we'll be modular and it will be cheap. And it's like, no, we'll be modular and this will be the most expensive thing you've ever bought in your entire life. So, you know, there are these moments where I think there will be lessons learned. I think that the amount of, you know, there's a bunch of interesting conversations going on about office life, and architects are their own worst enemies. We work horrendous hours because we're wired that way and we're taught that way. And there's this expectation that everything should be due yesterday. I mean, I'm hoping that might shift, that urgency, you know, to finish and to just like, you know, I need it tomorrow. I need it yesterday. I need it yesterday. It's just like, yeah, you're not the only person in this game. There's a bunch of people. So maybe it will slow down. Maybe the slowness will impact something. It's hard to know. I mean, you know, architecture fights between, you know, being gobbled up by the global economy and resisting it. And so I think there'll be a lot of fallout from it. I don't know how it will impact it. Hopefully well. Hopefully people take something from this. I mean, you know, the thing that I love is you go out at night and you see all these families in all their variations, you know, a million different configurations of family, and they're walking after dinner. And I look at them and I think, wow, you know, normally you guys would be, one parent would be here, one parent would be there, the kids would never be together, they'd be driving back and forth across the city to get their kid to this thing and that thing and the other thing, and the grandparents would be, you know, and it's just like, and I just thought, I wonder how many people are actually going to go, it was really lovely just eating dinner together and going for a walk. Let's make that our new normal. Like that would be, to me, that would be the most profound impact that, you know, if all the architects went home and had dinner with their families. Any other questions, or are we good to go? That was super fun. It was interesting thinking about 20 plus years in the world of architecture. The other thing I highly recommend is I've given a performance art lecture with a choir behind me, and they break out into song every now and then. I did it with Veta Hilly in Vancouver. That's a really good way to give a lecture.
I guess just one more thing that comes to mind. You talked about how collective memory plays a role in a lot of your work. I don't know if that's something you can speak a little more about.
I think it's more a sensibility about how I move through the world and the things that I see and the things that captivate me, and my own sort of hardwiring. But I do think there are moments that catch you. I think one of the most powerful ones, I mean, it was something I stumbled across in my thesis, and arguably my thesis is about a curb cut, because when you stepped off the curb to cross the train tracks of this old train, your instinct was to look left and right because that's what you're taught. And it's an incredibly urban gesture to step off a curb and look left or right, right? There are these little things that are so ingrained in us that I think, you know, and so it made me think really carefully about how curb cuts, where they are, what you're looking at, how you position them, right? So there are things like that that have always interested me. And I think it's the same thing, sort of the same thing about trying to understand a building. You know, I've been working on 19 Duncan, and I picked it up. Sometime the projects at ERA will be in the office for 15 or 20 years, so multiple people will work on them. And I got 19 Duncan in my portfolio, and I went down to check it out, and I was looking at it, and the heritage description of it calls out all of the sills as stone, and the portico on the building is stone. And so I was looking at the building, and I noticed that the windowsill had a crack right in the middle, and it's a building with over 100 windows. And then I noticed that the next one had a crack in the exact same place, and the next one, every single sill had the exact same crack. So when I got back to the office, I went into the files and there was an article about it, about the building, and it was the first cast in place concrete building built in Toronto. And the sills were actually precast concrete, Roman stone, like, it wasn't Roman stone, it was a different company, but similar to Casa Loma, fake stone made out of concrete. So what we were seeing was the failure of the concrete and something in the production of the sill. So then I said, you know, we should probably just do some investigation and take that sill out and see what's going on. So we pulled the sill out and cut it in half. And the rebar that was spec'd was the early version of 10 bar, but they'd put in what looked like coat hanger wires. So everything had been under structural, like the structural had failed in the same way. And then when we digged a bit deeper, and the company went out of business after the contract. So there, you know, there's these great stories. And then the other thing about this building is there are these funny little flaps, bronze flaps at every other floor. It's like, what's that for? Well, it was also because it was a press building. It had one of the first fire. Brain is really tired. Like a sprinkler system. And they were worried that the loading of the water, if the sprinklers went off, was going to structurally damage, like might cause the building to fall down. So these little hinges were they were connected to a drain through the floor plate, and they were to allow water to spill out of the building in the event of a fire, so that you wouldn't have the extra loading of the water from the sprinkler system. So stuff like that, like, you could give me a building like that to play with and I'd just be gone for a month, which drives my colleagues insane. It's like, we have a deadline today.
Thank you, that's really great. If there are no more questions, just looking through if anybody sent something else. On behalf of BEAT, we'd like to give you, Annabelle, a special thank you for giving this talk virtually and connecting everyone during this time. To all the participants, you'll receive a Con Ed certificate by email for attending tonight's talk. And you can feel free to sign up for our mailing list on the BEAT website. It's www.beatoronto.com to receive notifications for upcoming events. So you can also follow BEAT on Instagram at BEAT_TO and Twitter at BEA Toronto to stay up to date. And thank you very much for everyone coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Annabelle.
Annabelle.
Thanks, Annabelle. Oh, look at you. I see you and I see you.
Thanks, Annabelle.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Thanks, Rania. Oh, hi, everybody. Oh, Amy. It's so nice to see all your faces. Mimi.